Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to another episode of You Are From God. We're so glad that you've joined us. I'm here with Scott, and today we are going to talk about another popular verse in the Bible. Scott, this one is popular, I think, for its application to a specific moment in many people's lives, and that is because this verse is often heard at marriage ceremonies. We are, of course, talking about 1 Corinthians 13. This chapter is only 13 verses long, so we're actually going to look at the whole chapter today. But so often, these words of Paul written to this first century church get taken out of context. And it's not necessarily in a bad way, but if this is the only way we think about this passage, Scott, it does a disservice to what the Bible is trying to teach us here, because there's no doubt about it. 1 Corinthians 13 has some beautiful language that is certainly applicable in the marriage relationship. But if we come to 1 Corinthians 13 only thinking of it as the marriage passage, we're not reading it correctly.
Even from the standpoint that I've heard people call it the love chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about that perspective of, okay, well, what kind of love are we talking about here? What's the context of what it's getting to? And Tyler, the amazing thing about this book is that there's a lot of division that is being talked about. And then you get to chapters 12 through 14, and it's the subject or the context of spiritual gifts.
Right.
And so in the midst of this conversation of spiritual gifts, in the midst of division conversation, you have this beautiful passage that fits extremely well in context, and therefore it certainly is worthy of our time, but it's also worth understanding the big picture when we talk about this kind of love.
Yeah, so understanding the spiritual gift context, right? Chapter 12 is all about these specific spiritual gifts and the issues that were causing division. 1 Corinthians 13 talks about the love that's to motivate how they view each other, and then chapter 14 goes on and talks about specifically prophecy and tongues. And chapter 13 is kind of this anchor point to kind of, they talk a little bit about it. Here's the principle to go through in solving these issues, and then going on and looking at actually solving the specific issues of those spiritual gifts. But for the first three verses, Scott, you just read these again. These might not be the ones you always hear at marriages, but they're still just beautiful language that Paul's inspired by God to write here. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. That's just verse 1. Importantly to note, one of the spiritual gifts in the first century was speaking in tongues. So there's a reason he's using this specifically. He's saying if I can talk in every single language possible but I don't have love, I'm just making a bunch of noise. Mm-hmm. So right off the bat here, you're getting the perspective of you can have all these blessings from God. You can be empowered by God's Spirit to do these things in this time, but if you actually aren't doing it with the right motive or attitude, you're just making a bunch of useless noise. Verse 2, and if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, again, these are all spiritual gifts that have been mentioned in the previous chapter, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have and I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. So the power there of even Paul saying, I could die, but if I'm not doing it for the right reasons, if I don't truly have a love for God and love for fellow man in my heart, I gain nothing. This is a waste. And it's so powerful to understand the weight behind his words here and the fact of just how important a godly focus and a godly definition of love is to the life of a Christian, certainly in the first century, but how much more so for us today as we strive to live for Jesus.
It's the foundation of everything that we do. And certainly when you see the scriptures and you see the love of our God, and he wants us to have that kind of love for him and that kind of love for one another. And that's the amazing thing about this chapter to me. You can have all of these unbelievable gifts. You can, as you just brought up, be a martyr, and it means nothing without love. And you just think about those thoughts and those things that come up and the difficulty that comes with that. And maybe we wouldn't talk about gifts or we wouldn't talk about being a martyr, but I could give all my money. I could give all my, in essence, time. But if I have the wrong motivation or if there's not love behind it, I'm just doing a checklist perspective, then it means nothing. And that's the importance of understanding the heart part. And then he goes on in verse 4, and he says, love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. We get into verse 8. Tyler, the interesting thing is, I've done it. I read these verses at weddings, verses 4 through 7. And so you think about those verses, and you're talking about from a wedding standpoint, a husband and a wife, you should be patient. You should be kind. All these things make total sense. Now you bring in the fact that he's talking about to each other, to God's people, to brothers and sisters in Christ, in a context of people that had division that was going on. And he's telling them, you need to get back to what truly matters, getting back to this relationship with God and with each other that is built upon love. Am I patient with people that are difficult to be patient with? Am I kind to people that I'm waiting for them to be kind to me first? That kind of a perspective. And you just think about all of these things. It's simple when you're first getting married, to have that kind of love for each other. But what about 10 years down the road? What about two people that just happen to go to the same congregation? How do we treat each other when it comes to those situations?
This is the guiding principle, right? It's love. God is love. He's shown his love for us. We're now to walk in love. And that's part of what we talk about on this program often, is the idea of that we are image bearers of God. The key component, I would argue, to that is if God is love, as 1 John talks about, then we are to be walking in love constantly. That takes growth and that takes practice, as some of these things talk about. I mean, you talk about not being resentful or not keeping a record of wrongs. That's really hard for all of us to do. Some of us struggle more than others, perhaps, we just keep the score, right? The scorecard. And we talk again about that in marriages sometime. There shouldn't be that scorecard. But the power of this is talking about, I'm supposed to love my spouse, but when I look across this person who just grates on my nerves, or we just don't see eye to eye, we just clash every time we talk, love is still to be the guiding motivation. I'm still to be patient and kind and not envy or boast around that person. One of the most powerful pieces of this to me, Scott, is in verse 6, where it says, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. This is where I think we really get a principle of this is not the world's definition of love or Tyler's definition of love. This is God's definition of godly love. Because a lot of the times in the world, love is defined as, you just do you live your best life, whatever you really want to do, I'm going to support you. I'm going to be supportive, and I'm just going to nod my head and be your yes man. That's not love, especially when it's here talking about wrongdoing, if something that God calls sin. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices with the truth. The loving thing is going to be to snatch that person out of the fire, is to warn that person that they're heading for a cliff and they're going to run straight off of it, spiritually speaking. And so this is a big understanding of, yes, even when there's division around sin and issues, love is still the primary motivating factor of what we say and what we do. And it leads into just this kind of all-encompassing, these four statements of the alls, right? Bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things, and enduring all things. We'll often paraphrase this as giving the benefit of the doubt, and love being long-suffering, willing to go through so much because of that care and concern we have for another person. But, Scott, I heard this a long time ago. One of the most powerful things for these three verses for me, or these four verses, I guess, for me to do is to insert God's name in the place of love, because God is love. So God is patient and kind. God does not envy or boast. God is not arrogant or rude. All these different things. And then, okay, well, that's powerful to understand how God is toward me. Now, let's put my name in here. Is Tyler patient and kind? Does Tyler not envy or boast? You, listener, you put your name into these verses in the place of love and see how we can be growing. This isn't to necessarily make us feel bad, but it is to open our eyes up and make us realize the way of love is something that we've been promised, as we'll see in this last part of the chapter, that is going to go with us until the end of our days. And so we need to be practicing in it and walking in it just as God calls us to. But that's what it means to be a Christian, to walk after Christ, is to strive for this awesome love that demands sacrifice, demands selflessness, but ultimately finds us at the foot of our Savior.
And it's important to point out that it's not based on me waiting for the other person to move first. This is about me looking at myself, the relationship I have with God, and understanding what I'm going to do. That in order not to take into account a wrong suffered, that means there was a wrong suffered.
Right.
So it's understanding the situations and being willing to to forgive as Jesus did, and to understand our relationship with one another. But to your point, if you continue on here, he talks about what really is such a powerful thing here. So it would be neat, if we could all speak in tongues. Like, I think that was the one in Corinth that they struggled with the most. It was just sort of like, I always call it the cool people had it. And then those that could do prophesying didn't, weren't looked up to as much. And so Paul's going to get into that in chapter 14. But here he makes this point of, you could have any of these spiritual gifts in the first century, but everybody can love. Everybody can have this kind of love for one another, no matter what the gift that they had. So in verse 8, love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. Now, some of this, Tyler, is getting into a bigger conversation when we're talking about what the purpose of spiritual gifts were, and especially in the first century, and what it means when the whole comes, the perfect comes. And so there was a need for the spiritual gifts in the first century. They couldn't turn to their Bibles like we can in the New Testament and just read it and study it and those types of things. There was a purpose to them. And this isn't what the point of the podcast is per se, but it's understanding the context here. But even with all of those things, it's love that prevails. Love is going to be more powerful. And as he goes on, he's just going to make this same point in a very different way.
Yeah, and again, these are ones that we'll sometimes hear read in the marriage ceremonies of today and of years gone by. But again, it's the idea of growing up and becoming mature and progressing in life. But Paul's making this as a spiritual application. Verse 11 says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." So again, you have this idea of progression, of understanding, of knowing God, even as he's known us. And so at the end of all this, Scott, I do think this is the marriage chapter, if you will, but I think it's not a marriage between a man and a woman. I think it's the marriage between God and his people. I think these are the verses that teach us what it looks like to be married to Christ. The Bible in many places talks about the church as the bride of Christ, and God in many places, Old Testament and New, describes his relationship with his chosen covenant people as a marriage relationship. There's faithfulness, there's devotion, there's adultery when there is unfaithfulness or going away from God, because that's the only side that can fail in that marriage is us. But when you see all this, this is the way of love, and this is certainly how God's people, if we are committed to Christ, this is how we're going to act. And it is a growth process. It does require maturing and learning and growing each and every day. But the great hope is understanding that as we learn, as we apply these things, that we are becoming more and more like the Lord each and every day. And the great encouragement before he gets into the specifics of chapter 14, he ends 1 Corinthians 13:13 by saying, "So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love." The fascinating part about this, Scott, is again pointing to the end. This is the verse where I think without a doubt you can say this is pointing to the end of all things. So you've got faith, hope, and love. At the end of all things, we'll often talk about how our faith is made sight. There's not going to be a need for faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Well, when those things come to pass, when Jesus returns, we don't need faith anymore, as it were. Hope, again, in that same passage of Hebrews 11:1, is that idea of we're hoping and looking to the future for something. Well, when Jesus comes to fulfill all those hopes, hope's been fulfilled. Love is what gets us through in the faith and the hope times of life now, and it's going to abide into eternity. So the great thing about pursuing love and growing in love is it's something that's going to follow us into our eternal home with God. That's how we need to be thinking about these things. And again, thinking about this passage not just as a good thing to read at a wedding to help a husband and wife and the people there celebrate. We certainly can and make the application, but the bigger picture of what the Bible is saying here is that we are called to walk in love. No matter what we're doing as we're interacting with whoever it may be, we are called to bear the image of the God who is love, because you and I are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.